Imagine the sheer, unadulterated terror of being a German anti-tank gunner in the late summer of 1941. You are dug in on the vast, unforgiving steppes of Western Russia, sweating through your field grey uniform in the sweltering heat. Your weapon is the standard issue 37mm Pak 36, a reliable, precise piece of German engineering that has effortlessly punched holes in Polish and French armour over the last 2 years. Through the haze of dust, a silhouette emerges, but it looks entirely wrong. It does not have the boxy, vertical profile of the tanks you are used to fighting. It sits low, wide, and its armour is sloped at radical angles, making it look like a squashed steel predator. You wait for the beast to close the distance, relying on your training, and when it crosses the 500-yard mark, you squeeze the trigger. The armour-piercing shell streaks across the battlefield, striking the front plate of the Soviet tank dead center. But instead of the satisfying crunch of penetrating steel, there is a sharp, metallic ping, and your shell ricochets harmlessly into the sky. You load again, fire again, and get the exact same result. The monster does not even slow down. Its wide tracks churn the earth as it accelerates, its massive 76mm gun lowering to point directly at your position. In that horrifying fraction of a second, the myth of German armoured invincibility shatters. The weapon bearing down on you is not a finely tuned sports car of war, but a crude, brutal sledgehammer built for one singular purpose, which is to obliterate the Wehrmacht. Before we dive deep into the grease, blood, and shattered steel of the Eastern Front, I need to ask you a question. How does a nation that was essentially a feudal agrarian backwater just 20 years prior manage to design and mass-produce a machine that completely rewrites the rules of armoured warfare overnight? We are going to answer that today, stripping away the myths and looking at the raw, unforgiving math of industrial combat. If you want to understand how wars are actually won and lost, not in the movies, but in the mud, hit that subscribe button and join our command post. We analyze history through the lens of firepower, logistics, and cold, hard reality. To understand the birth of the T-34, we have to look far past the battlefields of 1941 and dig into the strategic paranoia of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. After the catastrophic bloodletting of the First World War and the brutal Russian Civil War, the Soviet leadership was acutely aware that they were surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. They knew another great war was coming, and they knew their peasant army would be slaughtered if it had to face modern, mechanized forces. In a bizarre twist of historical irony, the seeds of Soviet armored dominance were actually planted with the help of the Germans. Under the secret Treaty of Rapallo in 1922, the Weimar Republic, desperate to bypass the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, set up a clandestine tank training facility deep inside Russia at Kama. For years, German and Soviet officers trained side by side, testing tactics and prototype tanks far from the prying eyes of the British and the French. The Soviets were taking furious notes, absorbing German theories on mobility and combined arms. But theory without industrial muscle is just poetry, and Joseph Stalin had no interest in poetry. Through his brutal 5-year plans, Stalin forced the Soviet Union through a hyper-industrialization process that cost millions of lives, starving the countryside to build massive steel mills, tractor factories, and heavy machinery plants in cities like Kharkov, Stalingrad, and Chelyabinsk. While the factories were being built, the Red Army was trying to figure out what kind of tanks they actually needed. They looked across the Atlantic and found inspiration in an eccentric American engineer named J. Walter Christie. Christie had developed a revolutionary suspension system using large road wheels and long coil springs, allowing tanks to travel at blistering speeds. The United States military establishment, bogged down in peacetime bureaucracy, largely ignored Christie, thinking his designs were too radical. The Soviets, however, bought 2 of his turretless prototypes, shipped them to Russia under the fraudulent label of agricultural tractors, and reverse-engineered them. This American DNA became the foundation for the Soviet BT series of fast tanks. But speed alone does not win wars. During the Spanish Civil War in 1936, the Soviets sent their BT-5 and T-26 tanks to support the Republicans, and the results were a brutal wake-up call. The thin, vertical armor of these light tanks was easily shredded by German and Italian 37mm anti-tank guns. Furthermore, their gasoline engines had a terrifying tendency to erupt into catastrophic fireballs when hit. The lessons of Spain were clear, but it took another bloody skirmish halfway across the world to hammer the final nail into the coffin of light tank doctrine. In the summer of 1939, at a remote river called Khalkhin Gol on the Mongolian-Manchurian border, a young, aggressive Soviet commander named Georgy Zhukov launched a massive armored offensive against the Imperial Japanese Army. While Zhukov secured a crushing victory, he noted with alarm how easily his BT tanks were destroyed by Japanese infantry using improvised explosives and light anti-tank fire. The writing was on the wall. The Red Army needed a medium tank that combined the speed of the Christie suspension, with armor thick enough to shrug off anti-tank fire, and a gun big enough to destroy anything it encountered. Enter Mikhail Koshkin, the brilliant, obsessive chief designer at the Kharkov locomotive factory. Koshkin was tasked with designing a replacement for the BT series. The military brass wanted a tank that could run on wheels on paved roads and tracks on cross-country terrain, a complex and fragile requirement. Koshkin argued vehemently against this, pushing for a purely tracked vehicle with heavier armor and a more powerful gun. He developed 2 prototypes, the A-20, which met the military's wheeled-tracked requirement, and the A-32, his personal project that relied entirely on tracks and carried a heavier 76mm gun. To prove his point, Koshkin took a massive gamble. In March 1940, with the final prototype now designated the T-34, Koshkin and his team drove 2 of these experimental tanks from Kharkov all the way to Moscow, a punishing journey of over 1,800 miles through the freezing Russian winter. It was a brutal stress test of the transmission, the suspension, and the crew. They arrived at the Kremlin, presenting the mud-caked, freezing machines directly to Stalin. The dictator was impressed, famously dubbing the tank the swallow of our armoured forces, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The grueling drive through the snow destroyed Koshkin's health. He contracted severe pneumonia and died in September 1940, never living to see his creation save his country. Koshkin's masterpiece was a triumph of brutalist engineering. The T-34 was not designed to be comfortable. It was not designed to be a precision instrument. It was designed to be lethal, and it was designed to be built by the thousands using semi-skilled labor. The most revolutionary aspect of the T-34 was its armor. Instead of bolting thick, vertical slabs of steel to the chassis like the Germans and the British did, Koshkin sloped the frontal armor at an extreme angle of 60 degrees from the vertical. This is basic high school trigonometry applied to battlefield survival. A steel plate that is 1.8 inches thick, when angled at 60 degrees, presents a line-of-sight thickness of nearly 3.6 inches to an incoming shell. Furthermore, the steep angle drastically increased the chance that an enemy projectile would simply deflect or shatter upon impact. Underneath that sloped armor sat the beating heart of the beast, the legendary V2 diesel engine. While the Germans, Americans, and British were still powering their tanks with highly flammable aviation gasoline, the Soviets developed a massive 12-cylinder, water-cooled diesel engine that cranked out 500 horsepower. The V2 was an engineering marvel, featuring an aluminum engine block to save weight, a concept derived directly from aircraft design. Diesel fuel was less prone to explosive ignition when hit, giving Soviet crews a slightly better chance of surviving a penetration. The combination of the V2 engine, the wide tracks that reduced ground pressure, and the Christie suspension gave the 30-ton T-34 unparalleled mobility. It could glide over deep mud and heavy snow that would bog down the narrow-tracked German Panzers. But a tank is only as good as the army that wields it, and in the summer of 1941, the Red Army was a decapitated giant stumbling in the dark. To understand the catastrophic mismatch that occurred during Operation Barbarossa, we must look at the strategic balance of forces and the deeply flawed command structures on both sides. Let us start with the Wehrmacht. By June 1941, the German military was the most lethal, experienced, and finely tuned war machine on the planet. They had perfected the doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, or the war of maneuver, which the world had come to know as Blitzkrieg. The German armored spearheads were organized into massive panzer groups, commanded by brilliant tacticians like Heinz Guderian and Ewald von Kleist. The German doctrine relied on combined arms, seamlessly integrating tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support from the Luftwaffe. What made the German panzer divisions so effective was not the size of their guns or the thickness of their armor, but their nervous system. Every single German tank was equipped with a two-way radio. This allowed tank commanders to communicate instantly. Coordinate maneuvers, concentrate fire, and react to a fluid battlefield. Furthermore, German tanks were designed with crew ergonomics in mind. The standard German medium tank, the Panzer III, had a 5-man crew, including a dedicated commander who sat in a cupola, with a 360-degree view of the battlefield. His only job was to direct the tank, spot targets, and communicate with other units. The gunner had superb Zeiss optics, allowing for deadly accurate fire at long ranges. However, the hardware of the Wehrmacht in 1941 was shockingly light. The German invasion force consisted of roughly 3,300 tanks, spread across 19 Panzer divisions. But a massive percentage of these were obsolete light tanks. There were hundreds of Panzer Is, armed only with twin machine guns. There were over 1,000 Panzer IIs, armed with a 20mm autocannon. The backbone of their armoured force was the Panzer III, which was primarily armed with a 50mm gun, and the Panzer IV, which carried a short-barreled 75mm gun, designed for lobbing high explosive shells at infantry, not for fighting other tanks. The Germans were confident. They believed their superior tactics, training, and communication would easily overcome whatever obsolete junk the Soviets threw at them. On the other side of the border, the Red Army looked like an unstoppable juggernaut on paper. The Soviet Union possessed a staggering 23,000 tanks, more than the rest of the world combined. But this number was a massive illusion. The vast majority of these were obsolete T-26s and BT series tanks, many of which were in a terrible state of disrepair, lacking spare parts, batteries, and trained crews. The command structure of the Red Army had been gutted by Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 and 1938. Over 35,000 officers, including the most brilliant military minds like Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who had pioneered the concept of deep battle, were executed or sent to the Gulag. Tukhachevsky's deep battle doctrine was actually a highly advanced concept, focusing on breaking through enemy lines and sending massive mechanized formations deep into the enemy rear to paralyze their logistics and command. But with the officers dead, the doctrine was abandoned, and the remaining leadership was paralyzed by fear, knowing that a single mistake could result in a bullet to the back of the head. In a frantic attempt to reorganize before the German invasion, the Soviets created 29 massive mechanized corps. These formations were absurdly large, each supposed to contain over 1,000 tanks. But they were logistical nightmares. They lacked transport trucks, recovery vehicles, fuel tankers, and most critically, they lacked radios. The Soviet industrial base, while massive, was struggling to transition to the new generation of tanks. By June 1941, the factories had only managed to produce about 1,200 T-34s and roughly 500 KV-1 heavy tanks. These new beasts were sprinkled randomly throughout the mechanized corps, meaning a single unit might have a mix of obsolete light tanks and brand new T-34s, making maintenance and tactical coordination impossible. The contrast in industrial capacity and philosophy between the two nations is reminiscent of the American experience in World War II, but taken to a brutal extreme. Think of the American arsenal of democracy, where the automotive factories of Detroit were converted to build Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers. The Americans prioritized standardization, reliability, and mass production. The Soviets did the same, but under the constant threat of annihilation. The German industrial complex, by contrast, was still heavily reliant on skilled artisans and precision engineering. They built tanks like they were building luxury automobiles, with tight tolerances and complex, over-engineered components. This made German tanks highly capable, but slow to produce and difficult to repair in the field. The T-34 was the exact opposite. It was rough, unpolished, and built with wide tolerances. The welds were often ugly. The armor plates sometimes did not align perfectly, and the interior was cramped and deafeningly loud. But it did not matter. The Soviets understood a grim statistical reality. The average lifespan of a tank on the Eastern Front was measured in weeks, if not days. Why spend thousands of man-hours polishing the transmission gears when the tank is likely to be blown up or abandoned in a swamp before the transmission ever wears out? This brings us to a critical historical comparison. The shock the Germans experienced upon encountering the T-34 is incredibly similar to the shock the United States Navy experienced when they first encountered the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 in the early days of the Pacific War. The Americans, flying heavier, less maneuverable fighters, suddenly found themselves outclassed by a machine they did not even know existed. Designed by an enemy they had fundamentally underestimated. Or consider Task Force Smith in the opening days of the Korean War in 1950. American infantrymen, armed with obsolete bazookas, watched in horror as North Korean T-34-85s simply drove through their roadblocks, immune to their fire. In 1941, the Wehrmacht was about to experience that exact same terrifying paradigm shift, but on a scale that would determine the fate of the world. The stage was set for the most colossal clash of armor in human history. On one side, the highly trained, radio-equipped, tactically brilliant German Panzer divisions wielding undergunned and under-armored machines. On the other side, a chaotic, poorly led, partially blind Soviet armored force possessing a small number of machines that were technologically years ahead of anything the Germans had fielded. The tension along the border was palpable. Soviet intelligence was screaming that an invasion was imminent, but Stalin stubbornly refused to believe it, forbidding his frontline units from taking defensive positions lest they provoke the Germans. The mighty Soviet mechanized corps were parked in neat rows, their fuel tanks half empty, their crews sleeping in their barracks. As the sun began to rise on the morning of June 22, 1941, the silence of the dawn was shattered by the roar of thousands of German artillery pieces opening fire across a 1,000-mile front. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The sky darkened with Luftwaffe bombers, and the engines of 3,000 Panzers roared to life, their tracks biting into the Russian soil as they surged eastward. The German commanders expected a swift, decisive campaign, a repeat of their triumphs in France and Poland. They expected to kick in the door and watch the whole rotten Soviet structure come crashing down. But as the German spearheads pushed deeper into the dust and chaos of the frontier, bypassing burning Soviet airfields and shattered infantry divisions, they were about to run headlong into Koshkin's brutal masterpiece, and the war was about to change forever. The first encounters were not grand. Sweeping tank battles, but isolated, terrifying skirmishes born out of pure chaos. As the German Panzer spearheads sliced through the shattered remnants of the Soviet frontier defenses in late June 1941, they began to report contact with a new, unidentified Russian tank. The reports coming back to German High Command sounded like the panicked excuses of routed men. Anti-tank crews from Army Group Center and Army Group North frantically radioed that their standard 37mm armor-piercing shells were bouncing off these new Soviet machines at point-blank range. To understand exactly why the T-34 induced such absolute paralysis in the German ranks, we have to tear off the armor plate, climb inside the cramped, freezing hull, and look at the brutal reality of operating this machine in combat. The T-34 Model 1940 and 1941 carried a 76.2mm main gun, initially the L-11 and soon upgraded to the much more lethal F-34. This gun was an absolute monster for its time. It could fire a 14-pound armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of over 2,100 feet per second. At a range of 1,000 yards, that shell could punch through nearly 2.5 inches of vertical steel. Let me put that into perspective. The heaviest armor on the front of a standard German Panzer III at that time was only about 1.2 inches thick. The T-34 could rip a German tank apart from ranges where the German gunner could not even scratch the Soviet paint job. And when the Germans did manage to close the distance and fire back, they hit that legendary sloped armor. The front glacis plate of the T-34 was 45mm thick, angled at 60 degrees. But it was not just the geometry that defeated the German shells, it was the sheer kinetic deflection. When a lightweight German shell hit that slope, the energy was directed upward, causing the projectile to shatter or skip off like a flat stone on a pond. But if the T-34 was so heavily armed and armored, why were the Soviets losing them by the thousands in the opening weeks of the war? The answer lies inside the turret, in a fatal design flaw that crippled the tank's tactical effectiveness. The T-34 had a two-man turret. This meant the tank commander was also the gunner. Think about the sheer cognitive overload of that setup. In a German Panzer, the commander sat in a dedicated cupola, his head on a swivel, scanning the horizon, identifying targets, and directing his driver and gunner via an internal intercom. The German commander was the conductor of a lethal orchestra. The Soviet commander, by contrast, was forced to look through a narrow, low-quality periscope. To fire the gun, he had to take his eyes off the battlefield, peer through the telescopic sight, acquire the target, crank the manual traverse wheel, calculate the range, and fire. He was essentially fighting with one eye closed and one hand tied behind his back. This catastrophic lack of situational awareness is exactly what doomed the heavy French Char B-1 tanks during the Battle of France in 1940, and it is the same bitter lesson the US Army Air Forces learned early in the war, when they realized a fighter pilot cannot effectively fly, navigate, and shoot down enemy planes without a dedicated wingman to watch his 6 o'clock. A weapon is utterly useless if you cannot see who is shooting at you. To make matters worse, Soviet optics in 1941 were notoriously poor. The glass was cloudy, often yellowing, and prone to fogging up in the damp Russian climate. Then there was the issue of communication. In 1941, only the company commanders' T-34s were equipped with radios, and even those were fragile. Unreliable tube sets. The rest of the platoon had to rely on flag signals. Imagine being a Soviet tank driver, locked inside a deafening steel box with a massive 500 horsepower V2 diesel engine roaring just inches behind your head. Your commander pops the hatch, stands up into a hail of machine gun fire, and waves a pair of colored flags to tell the tanks next to you to turn left. It was an archaic, suicidal method of command and control. Once the shooting started, the formation inevitably dissolved into a chaotic free-for-all, where every tank fought a lonely, isolated battle. Furthermore, driving the T-34 was an act of extreme physical endurance. The transmission was a crude, unsynchronized 4-speed gearbox. The clutch was so incredibly stiff that drivers routinely lost up to 5 pounds of body weight in sweat during a single day of combat operations. It was a common practice for the driver to keep a heavy wooden mallet or a sledgehammer next to his seat. When the gears refused to mesh, he would literally smash the gearshift lever into place. There was no turret basket, meaning that as the turret rotated, the commander and loader had to physically scramble over piles of ammunition boxes scattered on the floor, trying not to get their legs crushed by the gun breech. The T-34 was not designed to keep its crew comfortable. It was designed to keep them alive just long enough to deliver a fatal blow to the enemy. How do you stop an enemy that holds every tactical and communicative advantage, but cannot physically penetrate your armor? You force them to fight on your terms, in terrain that neutralizes their speed and amplifies your firepower. This brings us to the first week of October 1941, and a muddy, unremarkable stretch of road near the Russian town of Mtsensk. The German 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by the legendary Heinz Guderian, was tearing toward Moscow. Guderian's spearhead, the elite 4th Panzer Division, had been rolling over Soviet infantry for months. They were arrogant, moving fast, and strung out along the main highway. Waiting for them was the Soviet 4th Tank Brigade, commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katukov. Katukov was not a victim of Stalin's purges, and he was one of the few Soviet commanders who understood that charging blindly across open fields was a death sentence against the Germans. Katukov had a handful of early model T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks. Instead of meeting the Germans in a sprawling maneuver battle, Katukov ordered his tanks into the dense, heavily wooded tree lines flanking the highway. He ordered his crews to dig their tanks into the earth, camouflaging the hulls with branches and mud until only the turrets and the long 76mm guns were visible. He set up a classic kill zone. Katukov's setup at Metsensk was a masterclass in asymmetric ambush tactics, bearing a striking resemblance to how American General Daniel Morgan deployed his forces at the Battle of Cowpens during the Revolutionary War. Morgan knew his militia could not stand toe-to-toe with British regulars in an open field, so he used the terrain to funnel a highly aggressive, overconfident enemy into a devastating crossfire. Katukov did exactly the same thing with 30 tons of Soviet steel. On the morning of October 4th, the vanguard of the 4th Panzer Division clattered down the road. They were primarily driving Czech-built Panzer 38s and standard Panzer IIs. The air was crisp, the temperature hovering around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and a light mist clung to the ground. Katukov held his fire. He let the German reconnaissance motorcycles and half-tracks pass, waiting for the main body of enemy armor to enter the trap. When the German tanks were less than 500 yards away, sitting ducks on the elevated road, Katukov gave the order. The tree line erupted in a synchronized volley of high-velocity gunfire. The first salvo decapitated the German column. The heavy Soviet shells ripped through the thin side armor of the Panzers, sparking catastrophic ammunition fires. Turrets were blown off their chassis, landing in the muddy ditches. The German commanders, completely caught off guard, desperately tried to pivot their tanks and return fire. But they could not see the enemy. The T-34s were perfectly concealed, and their smokeless powder made it nearly impossible to pinpoint the source of the incoming fire. When the Germans finally spotted the low, sloped profiles of the Soviet tanks in the woods, they opened up with their 37 and 50mm guns. It was an exercise in futility. The German armor-piercing rounds struck the sloped glacis plates of the T-34s and ricocheted off into the trees, leaving nothing but shallow gouges in the steel. The German infantry, pinned down behind their burning vehicles, watched in horror as their vaunted panzers were systematically dismantled. What goes through the mind of an elite German tank commander when his primary weapon is suddenly rendered utterly useless? Panic, followed by a desperate scramble for survival. The Germans tried to call in artillery and Luftwaffe support, but Katukov was already one step ahead. As soon as the German column was shattered, Katukov ordered his T-34s to break cover, reverse out of their dug-in positions, and fall back to the next pre-planned ambush site several miles down the road. By the time the German Stuka dive bombers arrived, they found nothing but the burning wreckage of their own tanks. Over the next week, Katukov repeated this bloody hit-and-run tactic all the way down the road to Metsensk. The 4th Panzer Division, one of the most decorated units in the Wehrmacht, was bled white. They lost dozens of tanks and hundreds of veteran crewmen. Heinz Guderian himself travelled to the front line to inspect the shattered remains of his armour. In his memoirs, Guderian later wrote with chilling clarity that up to this point they had enjoyed tank superiority, but from now on the situation was reversed. The psychological impact on the German forces was devastating. They coined a term for it, Panzerangst, or tank terror. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered by a crude, unpolished machine built by peasant labourers. But Katukov's brilliant ambush was only half of the nightmare the Germans were about to face. As October dragged on, the Russian weather unleashed its own devastating weapon, the Rasputitsa, or the time without roads. The autumn rains turned the unpaved Russian dirt roads into bottomless rivers of thick, freezing mud. This is where the engineering philosophy of the T-34 truly paid off. The German tanks, with their narrow tracks and high ground pressure, sank up to their bellies. Their complex, interleaved road wheels became packed with mud, which would freeze solid overnight, completely immobilizing the vehicles. The T-34, equipped with wide tracks and the massive torque of its V2 diesel engine, simply ground its way through the muck. The Soviet tank had a ground pressure of just 10.4 pounds per square inch, allowing it to practically float over the mud that swallowed the Panzers whole. The German blitzkrieg had finally ground to a freezing, bloody halt just miles from the gates of Moscow. Paralyzed by the mud, the cold, and the terrifying realization that they were fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity they had completely misjudged. As the mercury plummeted to 30 degrees below zero and the snow began to bury the frozen corpses of the Wehrmacht, the Soviet Union was frantically dismantling its entire heavy industry, loading thousands of factories onto trains and moving them deep into the Ural Mountains to build a tidal wave of armor. The survival of the Soviet state had been bought with the blood of millions, but the war of maneuver was officially dead, and the greatest, most horrific industrial meat grinder in human history was about to begin. The relocation of the Soviet industrial base in the winter of 1941 remains one of the most staggering logistical miracles in the history of human warfare. As the Wehrmacht battered against the outer defences of Moscow, the Soviet government ordered the complete dismantling of over 1,500 heavy industrial plants across Western Russia and Ukraine. Millions of tons of heavy machinery, lathes, presses, and blast furnace components were loaded onto flatbed rail cars and dragged hundreds of miles east, deep into the freezing, desolate expanse of the Ural Mountains and Siberia, far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. The crown jewel of this exodus was Factory Number 183, the birthplace of the T-34, which was relocated from Kharkov to the city of Nizhny Tagil, creating a sprawling, monolithic complex that would soon be known to the world simply as Tankograd. The conditions under which the T-34 was built during this period defy modern comprehension. When the trains arrived in the Urals, the ground was already frozen solid, by temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. There was no time to build the factory halls before production began. The heavy machine tools were quite literally, unceremoniously dumped off the trains, dragged into position by teams of starving labourers, and bolted directly to the frozen earth. The workers, primarily women, children, and elderly men whose sons and husbands were dying on the front lines, began milling steel and welding armour plates in the open air, while the brick walls and corrugated iron roofs of the factory were slowly built up around them. Workers routinely froze to death at their stations, their hands permanently fused to the freezing metal of the machines they were operating. How do you maintain strict quality control when your workforce is literally starving and freezing to death in a factory with no roof? The cold, brutal answer is that you do not. You completely redefine what quality means. The Soviet High Command understood that a tank only needed to function for its statistically probable lifespan on the Eastern Front, which in 1942 was roughly 14 days. Polished gears, comfortable leather seats, and finely machined interior fittings were a bourgeois luxury that the Red Army could not afford. The T-34s rolling out of Tankograd were incredibly crude. The armour plates were roughly torch-cut, leaving jagged, unfiled edges. The paint was often slapped on over bare, unprimed steel, if it was painted at all. The interior of the tank was left in raw steel, creating a deafening, cavernous echo chamber for the crew. But where it absolutely mattered, the engine, the gun, and the sloped armour. The engineering was robust and functional. This philosophy of mass production over micro-perfection is deeply familiar to the American industrial mindset. Echoing the construction of the Liberty ships by the Kaiser shipyards or the B-24 Liberators rolling off Henry Ford's Willow Run assembly line. The United States realized early in the war that building 10 perfectly engineered, handcrafted ships was strategically useless if the enemy could sink 12. The solution was to build 100 ships that were just good enough to get the job done. The Soviets applied this exact same American-style industrial logic to armored warfare, but they executed it with a level of human sacrifice and authoritarian brutality that is difficult to fathom. While German factories were still using highly skilled artisans to hand-tool the intricate, overlapping road wheels of their tanks, Tankograd was churning out T-34s using semi-automatic submerged arc welding, a technique pioneered by Soviet engineer Evgeny Patin, which allowed unskilled teenagers to weld heavy armour plates 5 times faster than a master welder. By 1943, this brutal industrial calculus had fundamentally shifted the balance of power. But the Germans were not sitting idle. Stung by the terror of the T-34, German engineers responded with their own terrifying generation of armoured predators, the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther and the mighty Panzerkampfwagen VIX Tiger. These new German cats were heavily armoured and armed with devastatingly accurate long-barrel 75mm and 88mm guns, complete with state-of-the-art Zeiss optics. Suddenly, the 76mm gun of the T-34, which had once been the terror of the Wehrmacht, was bouncing harmlessly off the thick frontal armour of the Tigers and Panthers at combat ranges. The T-34 was no longer the apex predator. It had become the prey. To understand how the Soviets adapted to this existential threat, we have to look at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest clash of armor in human history. The Germans launched Operation Citadel, a massive pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy the bulk of the Red Army in a salient jutting into the German lines. But the element of surprise, the crucial ingredient of the old blitzkrieg, was completely gone. Through an incredibly sophisticated intelligence network, heavily aided by the British decoding of the German Enigma machine and the Swiss-based Lucy spy ring, the Soviet High Command knew exactly where, when, and how the Germans were going to attack. Instead of launching a preemptive strike, the Soviets dug in. They constructed thousands of miles of trenches, laid over 1 million anti-tank mines, and positioned thousands of anti-tank guns in deeply layered defensive belts. When the German armoured spearheads finally attacked, they were forced to grind through this horrific defensive meat grinder. The climactic moment came at the dusty, smoke-choked fields of Prokhorovka, where hundreds of Soviet T-34s were hurled directly into the teeth of the elite SS Panzer divisions. The Soviet commanders knew their 76mm guns could not penetrate the heavy German armor at long range. So they employed a suicidal tactic. They ordered their drivers to slam the throttles wide open and charge the German lines at maximum speed, absorbing horrific casualties as they crossed the open ground, in order to close the distance to point-blank range. Once they were mixed in among the German formations, it became a chaotic, swirling knife fight in a phone booth. At ranges of less than 100 yards, the T-34s could finally punch through the thinner side and rear armor of the Tigers and Panthers. The dust was so thick that tanks rammed each other. Crews bailed out and fought with submachine guns and shovels. And the sky was completely blotted out by the smoke of hundreds of burning machines. The Soviets lost a staggering number of tanks at Prokhorovka, suffering a tactical defeat in terms of pure kill ratios. But strategically, it was a mortal blow to the Third Reich. This brings us to a crucial historical comparison regarding the grim arithmetic of attrition warfare. The Soviet strategy at Kursk and the subsequent counteroffensives mirror the brutal, relentless logic employed by Union General Ulysses S. Grant during the Overland Campaign of 1864 in the American Civil War. Grant understood that his opponent, Robert E. Lee, commanded a highly skilled, tactically brilliant army that could consistently inflict heavier casualties on Union forces. But Grant also knew that the industrialized North could replace its lost men and material, while the agrarian South could not. Grant simply locked onto Lee's army and refused to let go, bleeding the Army of Northern Virginia to death through sheer, unrelenting pressure. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov applied the exact same philosophy against the Wehrmacht. Zhukov knew he could lose 500 T-34s on a Tuesday, and Tankograd would replace them by Friday. German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, conversely, could not replace 50 lost Tigers in a month. The Germans were winning the tactical battles, but they were being mathematically annihilated. Following the bloodbath at Kursk, The Soviet High Command realized that relying on suicidal charges to defeat German heavy armor was unsustainable. The T-34 needed a massive upgrade, and it needed it immediately. The result was the T-34-85, introduced in early 1944. This was not just a minor refit. It was a fundamental transformation of the tank's fighting capabilities. The engineers ripped off the cramped two-man turret and replaced it with a massive, heavily armored three-man turret. Inside this new turret, they mounted a devastating 85mm gun, originally designed as a heavy anti-aircraft weapon. This new gun could easily punch through the front armor of a Tiger tank at over 1,000 yards knots. But the most revolutionary upgrade was not the gun. It was the addition of a dedicated human being. By expanding the turret to hold 3 men, the tank commander was finally freed from the burden of loading or firing the main gun. He was given a proper observation cupola with improved optics, allowing him to actually command the vehicle, spot targets, and coordinate with his platoon. Furthermore, by 1944, the Soviet electrical industry had finally caught up, and two-way radios became standard issue in almost every single T-34-85. The Red Army was no longer a blind, deaf giant stumbling around the battlefield with signal flags. They could now coordinate massive, sweeping armored maneuvers, concentrating their firepower and exploiting breakthroughs with terrifying speed. However, a tank is fundamentally useless if it runs out of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. The unsung hero of the Soviet armored juggernaut, the factor that truly allowed the T-34 to conquer half of Europe, was not built in Russia at all. It was built in South Bend, Indiana. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States supplied the Soviet Union with over 400,000 heavy transport trucks, primarily the legendary Studebaker US-6. The Red Army was heavily reliant on horse-drawn carts for logistics in 1941, which meant their tanks would constantly outrun their supply lines and stall out. The influx of American Studebakers completely motorized the Soviet logistical tail. When a pack of T-34s punched a hole in the German lines, the Studebakers could keep up with them, hauling thousands of tons of artillery shells, diesel fuel, and infantry across the muddy steppes to keep the momentum going. The T-34 was the steel fist that smashed the Wehrmacht, but it was American logistics that provided the muscle behind the swing. As the Red Army pushed relentlessly westward, driving the shattered remnants of the German army back through Poland and ultimately into the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, the T-34 cemented its legacy. It was not the most comfortable tank of the war, nor was it the most technologically advanced. If you put a single T-34 up against a single German Panther in a sterile, one-on-one duel, the Panther would likely win 9 times out of 10. But wars are not fought in a vacuum, and they are not won in one-on-one duels. The Soviet T-34 represents the ultimate triumph of macro-strategy over micro-tactics. It was a weapon perfectly calibrated for the horrific realities of the Eastern Front. It was simple enough to be built by starving peasants, rugged enough to survive the brutal Russian winter, and lethal enough to tear the heart out of the most professional army the world had ever seen. The German obsession with engineering perfection ultimately led to their downfall, as they built a small number of exquisite, over-engineered machines that were simply swallowed up by an endless ocean of crude, brutal and utterly relentless Soviet steel. In the final analysis, the history of mechanized warfare teaches us a cold, unforgiving truth. Wars of survival are not won by the finest machines, but by the machines that can be replaced, repaired and deployed in overwhelming numbers when the sky is falling and the world is burning. Which factor do you believe was most critical to the T-34's overwhelming success on the Eastern Front? A. Its revolutionary sloped armor and diesel engine design. B. The sheer mass production capabilities of the relocated Ural factories. C. The introduction of the 3-man turret and the 85mm gun. Drop your answer in the comments below. Let us know why, and make sure you are subscribed for our next deep dive into the machinery of war.